Welcome back to another episode of Shaping eCommerce. I'm Tim Bucciarelli, and I'm the Director of Engagement with IronPlane, an e-commerce agency focused on Magento Open Source, Adobe Commerce, and BigCommerce platforms. I'm here today talking with Curtis Schrum, who works with Shero Commerce, also in the e-commerce industry, also developing websites for merchants. And today's topic is the future of e-commerce. So Curtis, thank you very much for joining us today. I appreciate your time. And if you could just give everyone a brief intro of your background and your role at Shero Commerce, that would be great.
Sure, absolutely. Tim, thanks for having me. So my name is Curtis Schrum, as Tim mentioned. I am the head of strategy operations at Shero Commerce, which essentially means that I am responsible for playing the global game of chess of how we strategize to come up with ways to accomplish the goals directed by the company. And what Shero Commerce actually does is we're a digital transformation agency. So we do everything from digital marketing, brand initiatives, design initiatives, e-commerce implementations across a variety of platforms. And we basically work with partners and clients to get them to the next step of their evolution in the global world.
Awesome. Great. Thank you. And as I mentioned to you earlier, Curtis, my introduction to Shero is when I was a merchant and I went through an RFP process, and Shero was one of the respondents, and I had a very good experience working with Beth and the rest of the team there in that process. So shout out to Beth and the whole team at Shero. So today, like I said, we're talking about the future of e-commerce. And the first question is a pretty broad question, just getting your perspective on where you think e-commerce will be in 5 to 10 years.
Sure, absolutely. It's an interesting question because in 5 years, I honestly don't think it's going to be that different than it is today. If we were to look backwards 5 years, things are relatively the same, a lot of the same names, a lot of the same players, a lot of the same technologies, just things are more mature. And I think we're probably going to see things much the same within the 5 years, but I do think there's going to be a little bit of a contraction. We saw a huge expansion in the e-commerce world thanks to COVID and a lot of other factors, but people are wanting to go outside now. So I think we're going to see a little bit of a contraction in the next 5 years. Now, I think near that end of that 5-year window, we're going to see a bigger push towards what we call the mock approach, which I'm sure we'll touch on later, but microservices based, API first, cloud native SaaS, headless. Now, in 10 years, I think things are going to look very different than they do today. I think we're going to see much more of a push from brands to have an e-commerce space, but I think we're going to see brands moving more to having a type of organic storytelling with their clients where they're going to focus on a tactile feel and how they can reproduce that in-store experience of actually looking through their store and how to do shopping that way as much as they can, because we're already getting questions about that now. There's a lot of pushes in both directions, both to make the brick and mortar experience more seamless. So the ability to do type of AR or augmented reality type of shopping experience where maybe you can purchase things as you're going through the store, or maybe not even need to put things in a cart and just order as you're going through the store and checking things out, and they're ready for you when you leave. And then from the e-commerce side of things, the ability to use fully three-dimensional video and things like that to actually get to look at products and what they really look like, and notes for people both that have disabilities and those that don't of what something actually feels like, or things like that. I think we're going to see a big push in those directions because there very much is a feeling these days when you go into a store, or at least for a lot of our clients and customers, where when we go shopping, there's a frustration there of, I looked it up online, but it's not on the shelf and it says it is. And it's a very frustrating experience. And that comes from a space of ordering stuff online all the time. Or like, I picked out the things that I want and they arrived at my door.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think just when I think about ease of shopping also, I think about the voice interaction with your Alexa or with your Google Home and I feel like maybe that's 15 years out, is beyond, but I think that's an element that's going to be playing more of a role over time. I think the integrations are going to have to become more seamless. I think people are recognizing the thousands and thousands of technology elements that they can involve in their tech stack. it's getting to be too much. I think, yes, there's going to be a consolidation in the industry, which is great, I think, but it's also going to have those links between those platforms are going to have to be more standardized and more efficient for people to be able to use them. And I think the platforms that make themselves more compatible sooner, I think are going to have a leg up, because the integration between these systems is becoming so critical, especially if we are talking about the difference between monolith and composable. And we will get to that.
I'm sure we will.
All right, so let's talk about platform.
Yeah, definitely. It's hard not to talk about the big three in the room. So it's probably easier to start with Shopify of all of them, because it's one of the biggest players on the board. And when you talk about going online these days, Shopify is ubiquitous. Like, it's one of the first things that come to people's minds. I think Shopify is great for a lot of industries. When I'm talking to clients, when I'm talking to customers, I'm talking to merchants, and they don't know what platform they want, they ask me about Shopify, I always tell them, if you're a D2C customer who's never been online before, you don't have the robust tools, or maybe you don't even know how to do digital marketing, Shopify offers a really robust solution for customers like that. I'm not saying that large brands can't do well on Shopify. There are plenty that do. But you have to be very intentional about it, because Shopify was never built with big, giant brands in mind. It evolved to serve those brands. And Shopify has a lot of opinions about software you can use, integrations you can use, and also products that you can sell on their platform. And there's nothing wrong with that, to have those opinions. But not everybody fits into those molds. And that's where we lead to the second one that I always end up talking about, which is BigCommerce. It's, an up-and-comer. It's bigger than people think it is. They're having really a market year for them compared to the other platforms on the list. And really, it's two words sum up why, and those are open SaaS. The idea that Brent is pushing at BigCommerce is that they don't want to make the decisions for their clients. They want their clients, their customers, to make decisions for themselves, and they just want to give them the toolbox to do that with. BigCommerce does that really well. I've seen B2B and B2C customers do very well on them, and they even have specialized product offerings for CBD and B2B customers, and that's an interesting marketplace. Several firearm manufacturers are on BigCommerce, like CMMG. They operate on BigCommerce, so it's a big offering there. And then there's the third option, which arguably is not in any way a SaaS platform, which is Adobe Commerce. Adobe does a lot of things really well. And when they purchased Magento 4 years ago, 5 years ago now, they made a lot of ideas happen very quickly. And now it feels like they're shoring things up a bit. A lot of people are getting clicks and views these days talking about the death of Adobe Commerce. I don't think it's going anywhere. It drives a huge part of the market, and there are customers that need to be on Adobe Commerce. Large companies with very custom product sets, such as like fundraising companies or a chemical company, people who are going to need that type of finite, tight control over how their products work, with very large scale integrations, maybe with a home-baked ERP system. Or medical companies do very well on Magento because they can keep all of that in-house and control HIPAA. So those are the companies that do really well on Adobe Commerce. There's only two other big ones in the pool, and those are Commerce Tools, which is one of the only big names that offer that headless approach first, and the ability to get that type of offering out there. In reality, it competes with BigCommerce and SaaS pretty effectively. It doesn't compete with Adobe Commerce as much. I will say pricing on Commerce Tools is a little wonky because it's usually pretty custom. Then there's Salesforce Commerce Cloud, which I don't actually do a ton of development on. I do have quite a bit of experience with it. I will say that the customers that I see do very well on Salesforce Commerce Cloud had to do it already because of other things they have going on, or their solution to e-commerce is to throw money at the problem and make the problem go away. Both of those are great options, are great reasons to use Salesforce. And the only other one I would mention would be Open Commerce, which is currently owned by MailChimp. It is a direct counter offering to Commerce Tools. It's built on Next.js. It can be hosted through Vercel. But the only downside for it is it's one step above doing a bespoke implementation. You got to build a lot of stuff yourself. It just gives you a really great framework with a lot of your e-commerce offerings solved for you. So if you're a small business, it's probably not going to be outside the budget of what you really want to spend to get to market.
And does Open Commerce, does it have a built-in CMS?
It does not have a built-in CMS, but it integrates seamlessly with most of your easy-to-use ones like WordPress, Data CMS, and several others that are out there.
Okay. And we'll touch on Adobe and Magento in a little bit, but just for this conversation, let's touch on 3 areas I'm curious about. The difference between on-prem and SaaS. You already mentioned, actually, which is interesting, the medical industry and having a little bit more control, making on-prem a little bit more attractive. I'd like to go into that a little bit more. And also the whole idea of headless and composable, and what's your point of view on that?
Yeah.
And then if we can, we'll touch on just, this is a little bit of an outlier, but like the role that marketplaces play. Are they kind of still growing? Is it really for the big brands and the big organizations, or are smaller players getting involved? I guess in that order, if you'd like to talk about the on-prem versus SaaS first, that would be great.
Sure, absolutely. So I don't think on-prem is necessarily going anywhere, and I feel like that might be much to Adobe Commerce's chagrin. Because there are industries like the medical industry that need to control their code base, and they need to control every piece of what it touches and what kind of data is offered and what kind of data isn't offered. And I've worked with medical clients in the past. It can be very tricky to navigate those waters. Those type of on-prem offerings, there's always going to be a space for those. And something like Open Commerce or things like that, they also offer the option to control your code base. And those are important offerings. There are not many other reasons to go on-prem unless you just really want to absorb a lot of risks with owning your website. If you want to absorb the risk of cybersecurity concerns and keeping your software up to date and dealing with DDoS attacks and making sure that Cloudflare and all of those are configured correctly, sure, you could do that.
Or you can trust, essentially implicitly, in someone else to do that for you.
You can, and that leads us into SaaS. There is the Adobe Commerce offering that's cloud-based as well. But really, at the end of the day, you're still putting a lot of trust in those cloud performers. I think where your SaaS platforms really pull ahead of the on-prem offering, if you don't have a really good use case where you absolutely need to go on-prem, a SaaS offering offers the opportunity to offload a lot of risks and a lot of just day-to-day decision-making, as well as keeping your platform up to date, to experts that know that platform really well. And it's usually baked into the cost, like with BigCommerce, Shopify. And the cost to maintain a Magento website is, on average, thousands of dollars a month. It could be very cost-effective to go with a SaaS offering.
Yeah, we do some total cost of ownership analyses for prospective clients, and we try to help them understand when they're looking at SaaS, and we come up with some estimates of what their monthly subscription fee will be. And we compare that to Magento Open Source, which has no subscription or license fee, but the trade-off is that you have a monthly support fee, and your upfront cost may be a little bit higher. If you're migrating to a SaaS platform, yeah, you're still going to have a fair bit of cost initially. But over time, it's interesting to see what happens at the 6-year mark, for example, to see which one is more attractive for total cost of ownership. And it really depends, because if you're at the enterprise level and you're considering BigCommerce or Shopify Plus for that matter, then it can be pretty close sometimes with a Magento Open Source option. Where it gets tricky is if you're looking at Adobe Commerce and trying to compare that. And if you're really doing tons of volume and you see the monthlies going up from Shopify or BigCommerce because of your high volume, that's when it's an interesting calculation to do, and actually a very important calculation for any merchant considering those platforms, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that's something that can't be overlooked when you're doing a total cost of ownership is the expense of legacy code. That, like, things that will go by the wayside and not get updated, it can sometimes come back to bite you. There's been more than one of those cases this year with other platforms and major software companies that I won't mention or throw under the bus right now that have had some oversights from old code.
Yeah. Yep. Okay, so that's on-prem and SaaS. It's a little bit of a toss-up, but SaaS, generally speaking, would be simpler to manage, a little bit less maintenance, a little bit less headache, maybe less or lower total cost of ownership. On-prem, a little bit more customizable, a little bit more self-made and controllable. So interesting distinctions there. And then we've got this other option that's out there. Everyone's talking about it, of course, headless, composable. What does it mean? Why does it matter? Is it going to be the next big thing?
Is it going to be the next big thing? Let me tackle that first. A lot of people want it to be the next big thing. A lot of people really want it to be. Whether or not it is, I think it depends on how cheap we can get it down to implement for people. Because currently, today, putting somebody on a headless website, this is more of a comparison. It comes down for us at Shero of, if you're considering a truly headless website, you're probably also considering doing something like Adobe Commerce.
Yep.
Because that's the level of customization that you're going to need. It's going to be the same type of budget. Now let's talk about some of those words actually mean, because headless is a very big buzzword in the industry. It used to mean software that can operate without graphical user interface. That's what it used to mean, like without any type of graphical interface. Headless just ran without it. Today, it means an application or website where the front end or presentation layer is separated from the back end or software layer, and it's a pillar of that mock principle that I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier. And you've mentioned composable once, I think, in here, because that's another big buzzword. And all it really means is just building something from a myriad of related, hopefully reusable components. That's all it really means. There's a lot of other buzzwords out there, but the biggest thing to look at when you're going headless and what the benefit's going to be is you got to have a good use case to use a headless website. And by use case, I don't mean speed. Anyone who tells any merchant, you're going to be so much faster on headless, maybe you will. It depends on how it was built. Shero can get a BigCommerce or a Shopify implementation just on SaaS just about as fast as a really well-built headless site. It really just depends on what your site's doing. If you spend all that money to build a headless site, but one of the APIs you're connecting to is a SOAP API written in like 1994, your site's still going to wait on that API. It doesn't matter how fast the rest of it is. That data still has to get there. So speed is not a good use case. A really good use case to want to go headless is when your marketing team or your content team tells you, we have a story to tell, and we can't tell it within the box that this SaaS platform or Adobe Commerce has, and we need to be able to let loose our design juices and really just be able to go wild with something.
Without having to call a developer every time.
Exactly, without having to call a developer every time. And there are great tools out there, codeless tools out there, or near codeless tools to make that happen and put the control in there. And then you really start talking to your clients about what I want to talk to them about. And that's what I want to talk to customers about is, I don't want you to spend your money maintaining your website. I want you to spend your money building cool features. And I want to talk to you about how are we going to make an innovative push on a new marketing front, or how are you going to create diverse tools for your clients and customers. That's what we want to talk about. That's what we want you spending your money.
And I think you capture that idea perfectly, because I think about this, and I think there's definitely a category of Adobe Commerce and Magento merchants who are billion-dollar companies who can put a lot of money into it, and they can do both. They can manage the bugs, they can manage the updates, they can manage the ongoing maintenance, and they can do the cool new features. They can do it all. Okay, that's great. But then there's the rest of us, this middle ground, who want the flexibility and power that Magento and Adobe Commerce can provide, but really are frustrated over the past 10 years with all of these updates, all of these little intricacies that if one little thing doesn't work in a third-party module, it can throw off something else. Or that custom code, oh, I didn't test it properly, or this update threw that off. It's very complicated to maintain And if you are spending all of your money on that maintenance, it can be very frustrating for both the agency and the merchant, because the agency wants to do new, exciting things on behalf of the merchant. The best thing that can happen for an agency is a client comes to them and says, I want to implement this new functionality. I've got this great idea. Will you help me design it and implement it? And the agency says, I'm sorry, you're all out of your hours because we had to do that Magento upgrade or that security patch or fix those 20 bugs that have been sitting out there languishing for the past 6 months. That's the struggle. And so that's the pain that like SaaS tries to solve. But I also think, I hope somehow we will be able to get there or a little bit closer to that in the future for Magento and Adobe.
Well, I will say there are some partners out there that are making some of that reality come true sooner. Shogun, for example, is testing their Shogun front end and integrating it directly with Magento. That is one of those near codeless implementations out there that will make that reality closer for a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay, we'll touch very briefly on marketplaces because I do want to get your take on Adobe and Magento. But marketplaces, big deal, not that big a deal, just going to be there always?
Well, I think they're always going to be there. And if you asked me this question 5 years ago, I would say huge implications on the market. These days, the biggest impact that I see marketplace driving is expectations of customer. That trademarked one-click buy feature that Amazon has, everyone's trying to find a way to get that or some version of that on their website. Look at the shipping pushes. Customers aren't used to waiting 4 or 5 days anymore to get something in. They're used to getting in 3 days. And during the height of COVID, Walmart made huge strides with BOPUS, buy online, pick up in store. And even the SaaS platforms scrambled. Oh God, we have to get a BOPUS module. Like we didn't even know we needed that. So that's where the marketplaces, I think these days are having their biggest impact, is they're pushing innovation. But I don't think marketplaces are competing with e-commerce platforms anymore. Now, I say that, and one of the big ones will end up like tomorrow releasing their first e-commerce platform and make me look stupid. But I don't really see them competing with e-commerce that much these days. And I think to really be successful on those marketplaces like Wayfair or Amazon's marketplace, I think you've got to have a dedicated team. And they got to know how to sell on those, and they got to know how to market it, and they got to really push it out. And the customers themselves are changing. The way that customers arrive at your website today is not the way they arrived even 2 years ago at your website. These days, your Instagram and TikTok push almost more volume than Facebook does, and paid ads to websites. And marketplaces struggle to take advantage of those types of platforms. So I think their influence is waning in those areas because of it.
Okay. There's a time and a place for them, but not quite as much as you would have thought a few years ago. Okay, great. All right, so on to the question of Adobe and Magento. They're one and the same. Magento has a long history. How do you feel about what Adobe is getting right with their work in that space, and maybe what could they be doing better?
Oh, that's a good question. So what is Adobe getting right? I think Adobe's doing a really good job shoring up their position in the market space. And I think they're also fixing two things that Magento did not do well traditionally. One of them is they did really poor at documentation and training, and Adobe's helping get that right. And the other one is a release cadence of updates. The release cadence of Magento previously, 2016, was you might get one month, and then 2 in the next month, and then nothing for 4 months. Adobe's really helping mature that pipeline and help them understand like how semantic versioning is supposed to work and how to do a release cadence. Those are things I think Adobe's getting right day to day, every day. What I don't think they're doing quite so right is a lot of people feel like Adobe's leaving the small to mid-market behind. They're not focusing on innovating on their open source tools. Their sales team is not pushing the way that it used to the same types of clients. Now, they have said publicly that they're not leaving the small to mid-market behind, but most of the builds that we're seeing these days go to Adobe are very large builds, near 7-figure or better builds. A lot of that has to do with things we've talked about here today, because the cost of their commerce offering, if you're not going open source, is a big hurdle. And they waited way too long to adapt to that API first, headless mentality. They went all in, chips forward on PWA Studio, and they have recently said in a town hall this year that was a mistake. They're still not adapting quickly enough on their tooling to get there. GraphQL is still something that just does not work. And for merchants, GraphQL is a way of getting data that is a more leveled up way to get data. It's faster. And Magento currently runs on an older software known as MySQL, and it is one of the reasons that Magento sites are slow. So I think those are probably things that they're doing right and things that they could probably do better at.
Magento Open Source, from what I understand, it seems like it's like the secondary platform to Adobe. Adobe is very focused on getting people onto their Adobe Commerce platform, paying their subscription fee, not even subscription fee, wrong term, paying their license fee. And if they're on Adobe Commerce Cloud, which is really what they want to sell, also paying them for hosting and some degree of professional services. And that leaves Magento Open Source in this kind of middle ground where it used to be so driven by the community. But now that Adobe is moving in this direction to prioritize Adobe Commerce and Adobe Commerce Cloud, there's a feeling by the community that Magento Open Source is being left behind a little bit. And it's gonna be interesting to see what happens there, because that community is very passionate and very driven and very smart. And I'm very interested and excited, to be honest with you, to see where that community goes.
So, when you're talking about the open SaaS platform, it's interesting because I don't think the community feels like it's not being developed. It's arguably not. Pull requests are not getting merged into the code base. No one's managing it. No one's pushing it forward. If you were to ask me the 5 to 10 years question about open source, I would tell you that in 5 years, I don't think open source will be actively developed on Adobe. It'll be security updated. I don't think they're going to be accepting updates and pull requests. Somebody's going to have to fork it, and eventually people are going to get tired of having to maintain it themselves, because in 10 years, I think it'll be sunset, and there'll be a hitherto unannounced platform from Adobe built on the bones of Magento 2. But I can almost promise you it won't be open source, because that's not what Adobe does.
Right. Yeah.
And that's going to be a period of time where merchants are going to start scrambling. And Shero's trying to get ahead of that. We're talking to clients now that objectively should not be on Magento. Like, we're talking to clients right now, and if it's a small business merchant or even a mid-sized business merchant, open source Magento may very well not be the fit for you, and the time to transition to a SaaS platform is now.
Yep.
Save $250,000 over 5 years worth of updates and put that into your budget to expand your company. Make the move now. Don't wait 5 years.
Yeah, because a lot of small businesses got onto it. Magento Open Source has historically been a very attractive platform for smaller businesses, precisely because it doesn't have those licensing fees, and it's very powerful. But that conversation with clients who may be on a platform that's not still right for them is exactly what we're trying to do as well. It's the right thing to do with your clients. And one of the areas when we talk about Magento Open Source is that there actually is a fork that exists today, and it's gaining some traction. Mage-OS I'm not a betting man, but I think that's got some energy behind it. I'd like to see where that lands in 5 years.
We've definitely been keeping an eye on it. All of us have been looking at it. If you've been in the space a long time, I know a lot of the guys who are working on that. And I think that it has a lot of potential. I think there's also a certain amount of concern that if agencies start adopting the Mage-OS platform, or for some reason Adobe does completely sunset their open commerce, then it's going to be a fork of nothing. And at the end of the day, even though the Magento open source tool is open source, Adobe still owns it.
Yeah, they certainly own the brand.
Yeah, so it's definitely one of those things where that's tricky, but we're definitely keeping an eye on it. I think it needs to get more maturity underneath it before we really start relying on it, but it's definitely something.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a good snapshot of the various platforms and also various architectural designs, I guess I'd say. I'm also curious to hear your perspective on anything that's particularly innovative today that you think people should be paying attention to in the e-commerce space.
Yeah, I'd say there are really two things that are innovative today that people really need to be paying attention to. One of them is, from a merchant perspective, what your digital footprint looks like. What type of message are you telling to people? Because that is very much more a conversation today than it was even 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Shero is a member of the Titanium Worldwide Collective. It's a collective of agencies across the spectrum of mediums that are mostly a majority owned by minorities. We're proud to be a member of them. They help companies and merchants kind of identify what their digital footprint looks like and what kind of story you're telling. 3 years ago, ADA compliance accessibility was the only thing people were considering. Now it's about, how diverse does your company look? Do you have a diverse workforce? How does the language you're using on your site heard on the ear by people of different communities? That's something that I think merchants need to be paying a lot more attention to, and there are companies out there that can help address those concerns in a really respectful way and help companies understand how to adapt to a changing world. Because we used to make the joke when I first got into software that if you go to sleep and get up tomorrow, the software you read about yesterday is now obsolete. And it's becoming a world where the way the social norms change are becoming very close to that, and you need to stay up to date with that. The website you built last year and the language you used last year and the photos and the story that you told last year may not be the story you need to tell this year. We're leaving the space of the 2010s and early 2020s where you could let your site set for 2 or 3 years before you gave it a brand refresh. Those days are very rapidly going behind us, and companies are going to need to start looking at keeping their brand fresh and up to date every year.
So Titanium Worldwide, you said that's a collective of agencies?
Yeah, not just e-commerce agencies, digital design agencies,
Okay.
strategy agencies. They're all minority owned. It's an excellent organization to chat with and set up meetings with in the U.S. And they do have global partners as well. And that's probably one that I would say people need to pay attention to and make sure that they're, watching the winds change before they catch themselves on the wrong side of it. And obviously, selfishly, Shero is also an innovative company that people should pay attention to. But if I had to say there's one other one out there, there's an agency in New York City called The Mix with 2 X's. They're a digital marketing and design agency that are doing really amazing things. And they're really changing the spectrum of storytelling for merchants away from the product and focusing on the people.
Yeah, there's an agency in Boston called Proverb, and they've been doing that also. They've been doing a great job in that realm. I'm glad to hear you say that. That's very much in line with the way that we think as well. And I think that maybe what we'll try to do is we'll pull together some resources that could be included in the show notes that would provide some help to merchants who want to research that and want to do the best they can in whether it's sustainability, diversity, or accessibility. I've done another episode with Anna Caron from Snowdog on the topic of accessibility. We can include links to that show as well.
Snowdog still has the best mega menu ever built on Magento too.
All right, good. I'm sure they'll be glad to hear that. Cool, we'll be glad to hear that. All right. Curtis, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate your opinions and your insights, and I hope that this has been valuable to the merchants listening in. And I hope that Shero continues to build some great sites, and look forward to talking to you next time.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tim. I appreciate it, and I appreciate everybody who took the time to listen.
All right. Take care.